I was supposed to have somebody on, a nutritionist dietitian, to kind of run through the calories in, calories out portion of this. He decided that he didn't want to show up for the podcast. So I'll just run through that piece as well. So when we start off with what everybody's basically in the whole world is going with, is the calories in, calories out model. This is how you get fat. So what the calories in, calories out model means is that whatever calories you eat, put in your mouth and you eat, has to equal the amount of calories you burn, or else you get fat. So the idea is that if you're in a calorie deficit, you will lose weight. If you're in a calorie excess, you will gain weight. And so the idea is, you look at your plate and you add up all the calories that are on your plate. And then if you eat everything on the plate, all the calories that you ate go in and you count those for the day. And if your magic number is 2,500, if you eat 2,600 calories, you get fatter. If you eat 2,400 calories, you get thinner. So that's kind of how calories in, calories out works. The idea, the premise is that the body runs on calories. And if you get too many calories, you have too much energy, it's an excess of energy, and your body stores that as fat. And so that's kind of the premise behind calories in, calories out. And, that's roughly all there is to it. People try to make, all these other conditions and all these other things, but the calories in, calories out model is if you're in a calorie deficit, which is, again, less than your body's supposed to have for the day, you lose weight. And if you have more calories, if you eat more calories than you're supposed to, then you get fat. And so that's the thrust. Like however we want to spin it out, that's the thrust. So I'll kind of walk you through my journey with that. So a couple of years ago, I was fat, and people were like, "You weren't fat." I was fatty. Like I had way more fat on me than I wanted. It was bothering me. I cut my calories down like 1,600. My workouts got trashed. I mean, I just couldn't work out. I was tired. I was grouchy. Didn't see any fat loss at all. And then people are like, "Well, you're in starvation mode." And oh, okay. So now what it is that, if you get in starvation mode, your body holds on to everything you consume. So what the thinking on this is that you're supposed to eat less calories than you're supposed to eat during the day. And so if you eat a little bit less, you lose weight. If you eat too few, you can gain weight because your body holds on to everything. And so, okay, so I was eating too few calories. So I upped it to like 2,600, something like that. And my workouts got better. I was nicer. Everything was better, but still wasn't losing any fat. I wasn't really gaining any, but I wasn't really losing any. And I can go through what I was eating. I was eating a bunch of instant oatmeal. I was eating jasmine white rice. I was eating chicken. I was eating some steak. I had sugar in my oatmeal because oatmeal is disgusting and terrible. I've always hated it. But that's what I was supposed to eat, oatmeal, white rice, chicken, that type of stuff. So I was eating lots and lots of that, and didn't really have an effect on losing fat. And so I started looking at kind of what was going on, and I'm like, man, I can't figure this out, and I have a buddy who I've known for a long time, since college, and my buddy Richie can eat, at least during college, even to this day to a degree, could eat damn near anything he wanted and not gain any weight. And, I started thinking about that, and I was like, man, everybody knows a guy or a woman who seems to be able to eat whatever the hell they want. I'm like, Richie would eat like legit, like a giant pizza. He'd have, 15, 20 beers in a night. And then we'd all swing over to Taco Bell, and he'd get, the same thing or more than I would. The double taco supremes and the, all that type of stuff, and have 2 or 3 of those. And, every time I saw him, he's eating, never gained an ounce. And so when I started thinking about that, people were like, well, that happens. And, it's just, they have a higher metabolism. Calories work the same in them than they work in you. They just have a higher metabolism. Then I was looking at it and I was like, man, I got buddies who eat a lot more than me, a lot more calories than me, and they're thinner than me. And I got guys who eat the same as me, and they're thinner than me. I got guys who eat roughly the same as I do, and they're fatter than me. I'm like, so this, this doesn't make any sense to me. If calories are the standard, right? If that's the standard, then 1,000 calories should work the same in me as it works in everybody else. Nobody should have a faster metabolism, because if they have a faster metabolism, then it isn't a calorie issue. It's a metabolic function issue. So I was like, all right, cool. Let me look at this metabolism thing, right? So if I'm trying to speed my metabolism up, right? So I was like, well, maybe that's what I got to do. I got to speed up my metabolism, and then I'll lose fat, just like my buddy Richie. All right, cool. So if I'm talking about metabolism, we're talking about metabolic biochemistry, metabolic function. And so I was like, cool. All right, I'm going to start looking at the metabolic chemistry of what this is. And what I found out really quickly was that metabolic function is ruled by hormones. And I think that's, not, I don't know if you can debate that. It is pretty solidly ruled by hormones, because that's what tells the body what to do. And, there's a lot of hormones that come into play, and I had to learn all of them so I could figure out how they all play together. Estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, growth hormone, insulin, and glucagon. Now, the last two, insulin and glucagon, are your major players when we talk about metabolic function. So, but again, I was trying to figure out, okay, how do the excess calories make me fat? And so I was looking at the chemistry, and I couldn't find anywhere in the metabolic chemistry where it talked about calories, which is weird to me, because hey, I'm looking at metabolic biochemistry. Calories run the body. You got to think they'd be here somewhere. They weren't. I couldn't find them anywhere in the chemistry. Now, I did find something called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, which is made in the mitochondria, which you might remember from high school biology is the powerhouse of the cell. It makes the power for the body to run on, which is ATP. So like I said, I couldn't find calories anywhere. And I was like, well, all right, this is weird, but okay, so let's just go with the body runs on ATP, not on calories, and let's look at how is ATP generated. ATP is generated in two ways, one through sugar, through the glycolytic pathway, and one through fat, which is the lipolytic pathway. So nothing new at this point. We have all pretty much knew that the body runs on either sugars or it runs on fat. All right, fine. Well, how do we lose the fat? Because people talk about losing weight, and that's great. And I really don't care about losing weight. I wanted to lose the fat because I wanted to lean out, right? And so I kind of bucketed weight into different categories. So one was fat, one was muscle, one was bones and viscera, and one was like inflammatory chemicals. And so this is how I cut the body up. Like you can sort the body up however you want, but that's how I cut mine up, because I wanted to be able to have control over each one of them. So inflammatory chemicals, super easy. Detox those out. Your body loses all that water weight. Cool. Bones and viscera, you can do a little bit, but not very much. So just kind of scratch that one. Muscle, well, I wanted to keep my muscle. So if I weighed 250, 300 pounds and I was 5% body fat, I'd be fine with that. So, if I had giant amounts of muscle, I was, all right, that's fine. So I don't really care about that. The fat was what I cared about. And so I kind of reverse engineered it. And I was like, well, how does the body make fat? And I'll save you a lot of the biochemistry. But one of the ways that the body makes fat is that when you eat fat, your body kind of absorbs that and then stacks it over on the side. So again, I don't think anybody's, no crazy new news that if you eat fat, your body can store it as fat. So, okay, we'll leave that one to the side. The one that I found was that the fastest way your body actually makes fat is through sugar. So your body takes sugar in as glucose, and then it converts it into, through the glycolytic process, it breaks it down into its subspecies, and then it turns into basically glycerin, and then it ends up in a tag, which is a triacetylglyceride. Once it's there, it can then be differentiated into whatever else the body's going to do with it. So that's where your LDL, HDL, that's where all those things come in. But basically, once it gets converted into that, it is stored as fat. So sugars turn into fat. And so you're, all right, cool. So sugars are fat now. That's a pathway, which I think is still obvious. If you eat too many sugars, your body's going to store that excess as fat. So sugars and fats we now have coming in. And so I looked at it, I was like, okay, well, how do proteins turn into fats? Well, here's where the rub comes in. There's only one way that a protein can become a fat. Your body would have to turn it into a sugar, which it does all the time, what's called gluconeogenesis. And then you'd have to have so much glucose that the body would then raise the insulin levels enough that it would start storing that glucose as fat. Okay, because remember, the glycolytic pathway is ruled by insulin. There's the hormone for that. And the fat hormone that rules the fat is glucagon. And so what ends up happening is that, there's a couple different problems I have with the calorie system. One, the calorie system says that it's the energy the body runs on. That's not true. That's ATP. And then it tells you that this energy, if you could get too much of these caloric energies in, it turns to fat. So the problem is that the definition of a calorie is the amount of energy required to heat 1 kilogram of water 1 degree Celsius. So we have a couple problems now there. So what you're telling me is it's a unit of energy. Okay. So what would have to happen for calories to become fat is that calories have to go through energy to matter conversion. Thus, the energy you're having in magically through however we're going to talk about, Star Trek stuff, turns into matter. Because you can hold fat in your hand, you cannot hold calories in your hand. So the only way for calories to turn into fat is if they go through energy to matter conversion, which isn't going to happen. The other thing is that calories are never expressed in the body, because for a calorie to be expressed, you have to heat water 1 degree Celsius. So if you eat 2,000 calories and your body temperature never rises, calories haven't been expressed, because the way you measure it is the temperature of the water was 98 degrees. We added 10 calories. It is now 108 degrees. Okay. So if your body temperature doesn't get hotter at all, no calories are expressed. You're measuring it in calories. It's like today it's 70 degrees outside. If it got hotter, it would get to 80 degrees, and the difference is 10 degrees. That's the thing. If the temperature doesn't go up, no calories are expressed. So we have that issue as well. And so what we have to start finding out and we start looking at is that, okay, so how does the body deal with these sugars that it's turning into fats? The way that this process actually works is through insulin. And one of the other problems we have with the calorie system is that, like I said, if there's 1,000 calories on your plate and you eat the 1,000 calories, you have to account for the 1,000 calories, which also doesn't make any sense, because the way that we look at the body medically is it's not what you put in your mouth, it's what's absorbed across the intestinal mucosal line. So it's actually not from your mouth to your anus is not inside your body. It's in your digestive tract, which is technically outside your body. The only things that are in your body are what we absorb through the intestines. So this brings up another problem. If you eat 2,000 calories and 100 grams of that is insoluble fiber, that is 400 calories. That is 20% of everything you ate that day that doesn't ever get inside your body. So we now have to realize, okay, so absorptive function is a major player in how we get fat. Okay, so if you're going to count the calorie system and you're going to look at insoluble fiber, you're going to count those 400 calories that never made it inside your body, but they went inside your mouth. So now we have that issue as well. So, insoluble fiber is very functional for what we're talking about, because there's a lot of ways you can use insoluble fiber to, allow you to have foods you like, chips, pizza, tacos, like all sorts of things. So that's the issue we run into. And so that's one of the other problems we run into. Okay, we're counting this wrong. Well, the other thing is that what we also have to understand is that the way things get into the body through the intestinal mucosal membrane are also through insulin. And this is actually how you fix diabetes. I'll walk through that in a second. But we have to understand that, because when we start to have insulin resistance, it's because when we eat a carbohydrate and your body goes, oh, there's sugar, we need to increase the insulin so we can bring that sugar in. When that happens, it moves from the intestine across the intestinal mucosa membrane into the body. This is very, very important. So put a pen in this one, hold on to it later. So that's one of the problems. So if you've had a lot of carbohydrate function or a really high glycemic carbohydrate function, the glycemic function is how quickly a carbohydrate turns into sugar. So back when I was talking about, I was eating all that oatmeal and all that instant oatmeal and all the instant jasmine rice, massive, giant glycemic numbers on that. So it turns to sugar almost instantly, and a giant amount of it. And then if your insulin levels have been high because you have lots of carbohydrates, so your fasting insulin is 16, 17, 18, 20, the amount of sugars you'll actually pull across the intestinal mucosal membrane is a lot higher than you would normally. This is how, insulin resistance creates giant problems. And it's not so much insulin resistance to the cell. What ends up happening is that your body literally starts producing more insulin than it's supposed to, more insulin than it needs. And so what ends up happening is that you're sucking all this sugar in, and so all of a sudden it's in your blood. Well, what does your body do with the sugar that's in your blood? It will go to feeding the blood and feeding the brain and that type of thing. And then it will go to feeding the muscles. And then whatever glucose, that's the sugar that's in your blood, whatever glucose is left over will end up being stored in the muscle tissue as glycogen. And then it moves back around the whole body and it gets to the liver and it stores as glycogen in the liver. Any excess on top of that it doesn't need because it has to pull it out of the blood will then be converted into fat. And so that's how your body regulates the amount of sugars that's in it. And so that's where you're going to see the sugars turning into fats. Now, the way that your body processes these chemicals, the way that the actual functional sensitivity you have to insulin is going to increase the amount of fat storage that you happen to have. So that's how we store the fat. So the question is, all right, so how do we get rid of the fat? Well, the way that your body actually gets rid of the fat is, again, tied directly to glucose. So as glucose levels in the blood start to fall, so we have a decreasing glycolytic ATP. So ATP that is produced from glucose. As those levels start to fall, the alpha cells of the pancreas, the little cells that make glucagon, as the glycolytic ATP levels start to fall, it shuts down the calcium channel intake, pressure builds inside, and it puts pressure onto the glucagon receptacles, and the glucagon then kicks out in the bloodstream. Okay. Now, what does glucagon do? Glucagon's job is to partner with burning fat. And so your body now is burning fat for ATP creation instead of sugar. And so that's where the glucagon comes in. Now, the fun thing about glucagon is it also helps initiate a process called gluconeogenesis, where your body creates new sugar. It uses the lipolytic pathway to burn fat while it takes apart proteins and uses the proteins, the amino acids, and the carbon skeleton from the protein to then go through a process in the liver called gluconeogenesis, where it makes new sugar for the body. Now, what happens to the blood sugar at this time is as the blood sugar starts to drop, the liver starts to feed the blood sugar. So it starts dropping glucose into the sugar to normalize blood sugar levels. And as the liver starts to run out of sugar, we start refilling the levels of sugar in the liver with the gluconeogenesis. Okay, so that's how that happens. Now here's the rub. Here's why proteins will never become fat. So what ends up happening is that once your body starts getting to the point where it is, okay, we have corrected the levels of sugar in the blood, we've corrected the levels of sugar in the muscles, and we've refilled the liver with glycogen. Once those levels get where they're supposed to be, and you start having glycolytic ATP creation again, your body stops producing glucagon, and it starts producing insulin. Insulin stops the process of glucagon function. And so what ends up happening is that as you're taking apart the proteins to make the sugar, you're never going to get to the point where you have so much sugar from the protein that you're going to actually store it as fat, because as the insulin levels start coming back up, it inhibits the glucagon and actually stops the process of sugar creation. So you're just never going to get to the point where you have enough sugar to store. And so that's how that process works. Now, the way that you can kickstart this function is to cut back on your carbohydrates. As you cut back on your carbohydrates more and more and more, what ends up happening is that the amount of time that your body has to spend using fat and proteins to make its own sugar, call that endogenous sugar made inside the body, then what ends up happening is that the more fat you actually burn. Now, when we go back to the people who, one guy is really thin, one guy is kind of moderate, and one guy is super fat. This is called somatotyping. And this is basically the easiest way to explain this is how sensitive is this person to the two hormones, glucagon and insulin. So the guy at the one end of the table, and we never talk about this guy when we talk about weight loss, we talk about energy management, we talk about this type of thing. No one ever talks about the guy who cannot gain weight. Like everyone's talking about like, oh, I'll help you lose weight. Oh, come do my program. You'll lose weight. There's not a whole lot of, hey, can you not put any muscle mass on? Can you not grow? There's not a whole lot of, even acknowledgement that there are people who their primary concern is that they can't gain weight. So because we have excluded these people from the conversation and we don't recognize they exist, the only thing we think of is the mesomorphs, and those are the guys which you restrict their fuel source, whether it's fats or carbohydrates, and their body will start burning more fat. So these guys can cut their calories back or cut their fuel source back really easily, and they start to lose weight. So that's the middle guys. The guys on the very far end, you have to actually do work to get endomorphs, which is where I live. You have to do work to get those guys to increase glucagon function so their body will actually start burning more fat. So that's kind of how that somatotype system works. And so a lot of times in the somatotyping system, if you look at the somatotype research, what you find out is that glycemic function plays a giant role in this. And so guys who are wild ectomorphs who can't gain weight, if you give them really high glycemic foods, orange juices, the white rice, the instant, oatmeal, like the things that have really high glycemic function, the things that produce a lot of sugar, the things that produce a lot of glycemic function and thus a lot of insulin release, that's typically the easiest way to get these guys to gain weight. Not always, but that's typically what we see. Well, if you restrict that flow on the endomorphs, so you take away all of our sugars, that's why these guys lose weight. So that's why keto diets work really, really well for fatter guys. Now they'll work for everybody across the board because the mesomorphs, the same biochemistry runs their body as runs everybody else. Now here's the thing. Remember when we started breaking down weight and we talked about there's fat, there's water, there's muscle. So here's the problem. A lot of times, and mesomorphs are in, whatever, if you're ruling it by calories, and this is a big thing we see in the bodybuilding community, if you're ruling your diet by calories, when you cut your calories way back, you cut your fuel sources way back, what ends up happening is your body burns through all the carbohydrates, burns through all the sugars real fast, bang, out. And then it goes, okay, we need a lot more energy. We need a lot more ATP. And so we're going to start making it from fat. And so, yeah, you start burning the fat, but remember, to make sugar, you have to have proteins. Well, if you didn't eat enough protein, where's the body going to get this extra protein? It gets it from your muscle tissue. So it tears apart your muscle tissues to get the proteins and the amino acids it requires to go through gluconeogenesis. It burns the fat that's on your body. So yeah, you lost a lot of weight. You might have lost 5 pounds of fat and 5 pounds of muscle. So that's the thing that you have to keep in mind is that you don't want to lose weight. You want to lose fat. So you want to keep the muscles because the muscles where the ATP live, that's where your metabolism actually lives. So monitoring that is important because now that you understand that you can eat basically as much protein as you want, and you're not going to turn that into fat, well, now you have the keys to not lose muscle mass while you're losing fat. Pretty easy. In fact, you can build muscle mass really easily on a fast. I was running a 47-1 fast, so I'd eat once every 48 hours, and I was putting on muscle tissue like crazy and burning the fat off. So like this year, I'm right at between 35 and 40 pounds of fat that's lost, that muscle that was gained, because the scale is actually up a little bit from when I started in January, but I am much, much bigger than I was in January, and much, much more cut. And so that's kind of where that piece lies is in the somatotyping. You got to look at the glycemic function. But this is also why keto diets work so well. It's not because you're taking something away that your body needs. You're just not giving it from an outside source. Your body still has to have sugar. So your blood can only run on sugar. So people are like, your whole body can run on ketones. That is 100% not true. Your blood has to have sugar. It's just that where are we going to get it? Are we going to make it ourselves or are we going to bring it in from an outside source? So that's where that comes in. Your blood has no mitochondria, so it can't produce ATP. And so it has to use what's called cytolytic ATP, where as the glucose comes across the cell membrane of the red blood cell, it splits into two molecules of lactate. And when it does that, it releases 2 ATP. So that cytoplastic ATP duration comes from the sugars. And so that's why we have to make sugar to run the blood. So that's how that whole process works. And so when we start looking at keto diets, we're like, okay, so we've restricted all the carbohydrates. And so your body has to literally make its own sugar. And so it's making it from the protein you're eating and the fat you're eating and the fat that's on your body. So that's how that works. That's why people who go on keto lose so much fat so quickly, but they still maintain their strength and things like that. Now, I told you that we talked about how we fix diabetes. Diabetes is basically insulin resistance gone awry. It's way big. And so like you pull these people's insulin and it's 17 to 25. I've seen 30 on fasting insulin levels. And so what you do is you go, all right, cool. We're going to strip all the sugars out and we're going to make your body produce it endogenously. And so what you end up seeing is you see these, blood sugar numbers that are way off the chart. You strip them of all that. You don't have to put them in a keto diet, but putting them in a keto diet is the easiest for everybody. So that's usually what we do. Put them in a keto diet and all of a sudden their blood sugars come back down to basically normal because their body has to make it themselves. Now, here's the problem with normal. You have to understand, like even for people who are keto, there's something called the dawn effect. And so a lot of times what will happen is people will be on keto, they'll be on carnivore, and they'll get their blood drawn, they're fasting, everything's great. They get their blood drawn in the morning and their blood comes back 120, 130 blood sugar. And people are like, oh my gosh, you're diabetic. Okay, we need to stop and look at this for just a second. The amount of sugar that's in the blood is not what we need to worry about with diabetes because the amount of sugar that's in the blood is fine. The sugar itself is fine. The control, the regulation of the sugar is the problem. Well, what controls and what regulates sugar? Insulin. So again, you've got to pull fasting insulin, which nobody's on diabetes has done because I see these blood reports all the time and nobody pulls insulin. So again, you put them into a keto diet, their body makes the sugar for them, and let the body make as much sugar as it wants to. If it wants to sit at 130, 140, let it, because it's not going to do it for very long. Because again, it's still going to manage all that stuff from a glycogen function on the inside. So what you see over time is that not only do the fasting insulin levels come down, but the blood sugar levels come down and they normalize. And so that's the way that we've done it. Now, oftentimes people who've been stuck in this sugar state for a long time have a problem going from, super sugary into fat burning state. Okay. The way that you can kickstart glucagon production is with fasting. And so you tell the body, look, you're not going to get anything and you got to make all the stuff yourself. Like you got to pull all the fat off you. You got to, I use collagen and some stuff like that, but oftentimes just let it eat the muscle tissue because you can rebuild it pretty easily. So, all right, you got to make everything yourself. And so we're just going to fast. And for a couple of days, usually it takes, 48 to 72 hours, give or take on the individual. And their body will start producing glucagon again because it has to. It has to start producing blood sugar and it has to start, doing that by burning fat. Now there's a walkthrough that I'll usually do with people so that they understand what's going on. The other piece of that is that if someone's been running sugar system for a long time, you have to understand when they change gears and they start producing it via fat, this is kind of a muscle they haven't exercised in a long time. So getting it to work efficiently and well can take a minute. So that reflects in a couple of different ways. Some people lose a giant amount of fat real fast. Some people have like the keto flu as they start going through it. They start having detox issues. They start kind of feeling blah. Again, you need to walk them through that because lipolytic function requires a variety of things that glycolytic function doesn't. So for instance, it requires the production of a giant amount more bile salt. Well, if you don't have methylated B6, you're not going to produce bile salt properly. You're going to produce congealed bile salt that's going to end up turning into liver stones, which is when they're dropped in the gallbladder, they're squeezed together into larger liver bile stones, and we call them gallstones, which is one of the things we see with a lot of GLP agonists like semaglutide and stuff like that. And so that's the big piece. So you've got to kind of manage that. You've got to make sure that as you're pulling them into this and you're starting to manage the creation of ATP via fat, that lipolytic pathway, the body has all the chemistry it needs. The liver's clean, lots of B vitamins. It's got all the, all the nutrients and all the chemicals it requires to go through the process, like all the NADH and all that type of stuff. You got to have all those chemicals that are in the lipolytic pathway to do it safely. So that kind of brings up, okay, so how does the GLP stuff work? Well, the way semaglutide works is it activates the GLP receptor sites. Now, and here's the cool thing about this, because the research on it's actually wrong, because it says that it helps your body produce insulin, it helps the insulin kind of manage blood sugar. It doesn't do that at all. It actually does the exact opposite of that. What ends up happening is that it shuts off the gut's ability to bring in insulin. That's why it causes the gastroparesis. That's why it causes the body to kind of, the digestive system to kind of shut down, because it blocks the ability to take sugars through the intestine into the bloodstream. Okay? Because if you take in a bunch of sugar while you're doing this, it's going to throw off your body's ability to regulate what it's actually making. And so it shuts off your body's ability to bring in extra glucose from an exogenous source while it's producing the sugars from the endogenous source, so it can know how to stop. Okay? So that's more or less what's going on. So that's how these diabetics are taking it and they're losing all this weight. That's how these people are taking it and they're losing all this weight. But again, remember, what are the problems with GLP? Gallstone issues, cholecystitis, right? So that type of stuff. And then we have massive muscle wasting. You know, they found in some of the research studies that 40 to 50% of the weight that was lost with GLPs, it was muscle mass. Well, of course it was, because what did GLPs do? What does glucagon do? It helps your body process and start the process of gluconeogenesis. So it's going to tear apart proteins and it's going to make sugar out of them. If you're not eating enough proteins, oftentimes it'll eat the muscle tissue that you have. Now, the other thing about semaglutides that people don't talk about is that it also radically, for a lot of people, not everybody, for a lot of people, radically reduces the amount of food that they want to eat, because it makes your stomach feel full all the time. Like I know people who are like, even taking the supplements makes me feel like I'm going to throw up because I ate too much. And I'm like, yeah. So you bring in a lot less food. And so people are like, see, it's calories, but it's not. It's sugars and it's fats. So that's, it's a biochemical function. It's a macro function. It's not a energy from calories function. So you didn't bring enough protein. So your body had to utilize the protein it had access to, which is your muscle tissue. That's why you lost it. So that's how the system actually works. Now, if you're working on people who are those mesomorph guys, yeah, man, you can cut back total fuel and it's not that big of a deal. Like you can measure yourself with calories and that's fine. Like it'll work. The problem is that it won't work to put muscle on or weight on the guys who are on the ectomorph side. And it won't work to pull fat off of the really fat guys. Now, and this is where we get into the whole, like, the trainer's always right and the trainer's perfect. And, obviously, if you're not losing weight, then you didn't do my calorie deficit program right, because, it's flawless and that's how it works. And so we cut calories back and you lose the fat. That's how everything works. And if you didn't lose weight when you did the plan, then, you didn't really run it. You cheated. You ate too much. You didn't really follow it. And in the defense of all the trainers out there, that happens a lot. However, there's also the case where people do exactly what you say and they don't lose any fat. They don't lose any weight. Because again, it's a hormone-driven system that's based off of sugars becoming fat and fat becoming fat. So, the way that you can push this together is, and this is how I do mine. Like I tell people, like, bring me your 10 favorite foods and I'll build a diet out of it. And people are like, all right, tacos and pizza and brownies and cookies. Fantastic. Super easy to do, right? Because like you make a brownie that has no glycemic function, so there's no sugar in it. Nothing turns into sugar and you're good to go. Like lots of protein, stuff like that. You use, almond flour has fat in it, but then we do it back to the absorptive function with fiber. And so you kind of have to factor that in. So, you've got almond flour, you've got eggs, butter, you've got, some type of sweetener, monk fruit, erythritol, like that type of thing. Those are my favorites, monk fruit and erythritol, because erythritol is really, really awesome for your blood system, your cardiovascular system. And so, and cacao. And so you have this actually really healthy thing that tastes like brownies. And so it's super easy to get people and be like, okay, now here's the thing. Again, I never said that you could eat whatever you wanted to. It's a fuel system. How much carbohydrates and how much fat are you bringing in versus how much you're burning? So that function is actually real. So, but the thing is that if you bring in a ton of protein, like, look at smoked turkey. Smoked turkey has no carbohydrates. It has very little fat. It has a lot of protein. You can eat giant amounts of smoked turkey before it does anything to your waistline but make it go down. Because again, proteins and amino acids have been shown to increase glucagon production. So again, eating the protein helps increase glucagon function, which is how your body is going to create sugar for your body, and burn fat at the same time. So, so that's more or less how it works. And again, you can use GLPs if to fix diabetes. You can use keto and fasting to fix diabetes. The real thing is that you pull the fasting insulin, and then you work the diet in a manner where you drop the glycemic intake so low that the body has to first eat up all the sugar that's sitting around it, and then it has to start dumping sugar from the liver into the body. Then it produces glucagon, and then it starts refilling the sugars that your body's using via the liver. And so that's where the system starts. And that's where you start to see diabetes kind of going away. Now, here's the cool thing. If you're like, well, I want to go back to eating the sugary stuff, which so far nobody has actually wanted to do once we walked them through it. But all right, so how do we actually fix the diabetes? And this is pertinent for all type 2s. And some people who are diagnosed type 1, you're not really type 1, you're just a late stage, you're just an early stage type 2. So what ends up happening is that the body was designed and created to heal itself. And so if we just give it the chemicals it needs, or sometimes take away the chemicals it doesn't need, we can resolve this issue. And so what ends up happening is that your body, without the insulin production, or very, 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 very low insulin production, the insulin receptors on your intestinal mucosa and on your tissues, on your internal cells, your liver, your kidneys, your muscle tissues, like all that stuff, those receptors can start to heal and regenerate. And so after about 90 days, give or take, everybody's a little bit different. After about 90 days, your body has healed itself. And so you can start consuming the lower middle level glycemic carbohydrates now, and you're not going to have diabetic issues on top of it. I would tell you that about 30 to 40% of the diabetic population right now, if they just went keto, they would have little to no issues being keto, going keto, and having it fix their diabetes, which leaves a giant amount of like 60 to 70% that need a little bit of walking through it. So, it's one of those deals where if you're diabetic and you're like, hey, okay, that makes some sense to me because I keep hearing about people fixing their type 2 diabetes by changing their diet. I just never understood how it worked. Well, that's how it works. And so if you wanted to go keto and try it, you can. Now, it will technically work even if you do dirty keto. But the problem is that if you're doing dirty keto and eating things like sucralose and stuff like that, you're going to create secondary problems down the road. So learn to do keto properly and eat the clean fats, the clean sugar alternatives, and that type of stuff. So that would be my 2 cents on that one and how that goes in. But that's how this thing really works. Like I said, the reason it's confusing is that the calorie model does work really well for about 30% of the population, the population that's mesomorphs. And so the other thing you have to understand about somatotyping real quick is that it's not a set point. It's not 1, 2, and 3. It's an infinite array of sensitivities, between ectomorph and mesomorph. And so you can be ecto, you can be ectomeso, you can be meso-ecto, you can be meso, you can be meso-endo, endo-meso, or endo. Like those are just some of the differentiations in there. So this is why, some people, can eat, something and they get a little bit fat and the other person doesn't get fat at all. And the other person gets really fat is because the gradation of how your body utilizes or how sensitive it is to the two hormones, insulin and glucagon, matters a tremendous amount more than the amount of calories you consumed. So again, it's a hormonal piece. So, what's funny is that people are like, hey, it's all about calories in, calories out, but you should eat a high protein diet. Why? Well, because we find out that high protein diets help you lose fat. Well, I explained to you how, but doesn't that seem a little silly? Because if we look at how we're counting the calories to begin with, it is 4 calories for a carbohydrate and 4 calories for a protein. So you're telling me that in this counting system where we just count up how many calories we're eating, and that tells us if we get fat or not, the thing that produces glucagon, the thing that creates fat burning, the proteins, are counted the same way as the sugars, the thing that makes the body create fat chemically. So this is one of the problems I've got with it. If you're telling me that, we're going to count these things up, and at the end of the count, if we have too much, we get fat. If we have too little, we lose fat. And you're telling me that the thing that makes fat chemically and the thing that burns fat chemically are counted the same way in the same amount, I'm going to tell you your system's broken. And that's where my argument is on the calorie function. So that's kind of what's going on as far as those things go, especially because you're saying that sugars 4, insoluble fiber also 4 calories. The insoluble fiber we just discussed never gets inside the body, so it shouldn't be counted in any way. So, okay, so we now have 4 that's sugar that turns to fat chemically, 4 that never gets in the body, and 4 that burns fat. And so this is how we're monitoring and doing things right now. So, like I said, yes, the calorie system will work just fine on that middle piece of that middle group, the mesomorphs, who their body's more or less equally, for example, they're equally sensitive to both glucagon and insulin. So they build fat and they burn fat pretty much evenly. So if you cut back on what they're consuming, their body will eat up the sugar that's in the blood and then bang, start making sugar for the blood, burning the fat. So that's basically how they work. Everybody else is not doing that very well. So, they're either not storing the stuff in the tissue or they're storing way too much. So that's kind of how that works. Took me a long time to explain that, but that's kind of where it's at. So, unfortunately, my nutrition dietitian guy, who is going to explain the calories in, calories out, and then go back and forth with me on where I'm misled or where I don't understand chemistry or I don't understand how the body works and that type of thing, decided not to show up. So that's where it's at. So I'm going to post this, and if you guys, you guys go get all the way through it and you're like, oh, okay, here's where you're wrong. Here's where the calories really do play in. And here's a chemical equation showing calories. And here's how a calorie actually becomes a physical thing and becomes fat. So here's this. I would love to know, because this is the system I'm using. And while it's working really, really well, if it's not really the system we should be using, I want to make sure that I'm using the right system to work on people and get them healthy. So that's where it is. All right. You guys have fun, and thanks for your time.